I want to talk a little bit about how I'm coming to this talk, and then talk about the mediatization of gambling and its impact on sport. And this is something we're really seeing in Ireland. So I'm kind of be focusing on a local cultural context. And while we know, and Gerda has set up the issues, the international issues, the global issues, what's become apparent is that there's very specific local impacts of gambling, as well as it being an international industry. And I think this is really important as we start to study and explore gambling and its many manifestations. The next topic is related to some collaborative work I'm doing through the ADAPT Research Centre. And this gives us an insight, I think, to what's happening both in games and in gambling that connects the two of them. And these are the wider processes and use of technologies of datafication, AI, and surveillance, more generally, surveillance technologies. And from that, I will talk a little bit about how these are starting to impact in games and get more generally. And finally, just some first thoughts really on public policy in this area and regulation. So I like to think we're neighbours as I look at this map, even though we're quite a distance apart. And we have some very interesting, strong cultural connections, including sharing a rather large neighbour. And when it comes to media and games and gambling, the proximity of the UK to the Republic of Ireland is really important. I want to point that out as we go through the talk. My background is generally in the media, photography, games, sound production, video production back in the day. And now I study the production and the industry side more generally. Although I've done research on users and game players, most of my work over the past 20 years has been interested in the design of these products and who makes them, the makers of the products. Broadly defined, because sometimes that takes us into community management and other areas as well, which are broadly connected to the design of games and gambling. I'm located in a university in Ireland called Maynooth University. And if you just look at this map here, this yellow blob is Dublin, and we're just to the west of Dublin, about 35k. Although I'm coming to you today from Dublin, from North Dublin, as we're just coming out of COVID lockdown. Ireland has a very interesting and complicated history, not so far across the waters there from Glasgow, where Gerda is. But of course, what's interesting for us as we think about the media and gambling is that Ireland is staying in the EU while the UK is leaving. And we're very much in the same linguistic space, media space, Anglophone media space as the UK, North America, but then we're also in the shared regulatory space of the European Union. And this brings lots of complexities, I would say, when we start to look at public policy in these areas. Certainly health is a devolved responsibility, which means it's still a national priority, but other areas around media are shared European responsibilities. And so there's kind of a multi-layer level, somewhat, I suppose, akin to kind of federal local systems, perhaps in Canada and North America, but we do have that complicated public policy structure. As I come to this and as I speak to you today, I want to outline that my background is very much coming from a political economy of the media and political economy more generally as it's situated within sociology. So I am interested in the study of social relations, but also of power. And this really very much frames how I approach gaming, gambling, and the media. And I called out a Canadian scholar here, given the audience that I'm speaking to today. But the culture industries, as we used to talk about them, is a very interesting term, I think, to hold on to, and then to put in comparison to the newer terminology of creative industries or the entertainment and leisure industries, as the gambling industry likes to talk about itself within this kind of frame. And I think we can see real tensions across these industries, as of course they're trying to make money, but then they also talk about what is their value for society and for the public more generally. And games, of course, are have existed for an awful long time before they became digital technologies. And I think what we have to hold on to is the fact that they are currently now, in many cases, digital games are designed and produced industrially. And while they have meaning and they are designed with certain purposes in mind, users also then can reinterpret them and negotiate them and struggle with them. And so it's a very interesting, fascinating, and complex set of challenges for researchers as we study both the design, production, and use of media more generally, and within this, games and increasingly gambling or ways of gambling. I also then in the last 20 years have been coming to this from within game studies, as it's now called, which is quite interdisciplinary. And we have seen people coming together looking at both the industries of producing these games, but then also the cultures of play that emerge around them and the kind of negotiations of them. If you're new to game studies, I'll point you to the work here of the Center of Excellence in Game Culture Studies in Tampere in Finland, which is a really good example of groups working across these different elements of games, the industry, cultures of use, and increasingly some of the regulatory issues. But today, more specifically, I want to focus on just these two things. The first is the report I've done with two colleagues in Maynooth University, Professor John O'Brennan and Lucia Vasquez Mendoza. This was funded by the Gambling Awareness Trust in Ireland, and there's not an awful lot of research has been done on gambling in Ireland, and particularly not from a non-medical, non-health perspective. And I became very interested in it on the back of this other book, Global Games, where I started to look at the shift in business models around 2012, where we saw games really shifting and moving into that social media mobile space that Gerda so well outlined for us. And we started to see game companies really for the first time in the time I had been looking at them, starting to use language which was blurring boundaries. So already I would say that this has definitely been happening for almost the last decade as we started to look at the games industry. So coming from the game side, some of the companies were starting to talk about freemium business models, about how to get people to pay for microtransactions in games. And even some companies were leaving behind when they couldn't make enough money. They were overtly moving into online casino type games and mechanisms. And then finally, just drawing upon a little bit of work that I've been publishing more recently around AI, working with colleagues in the Adapt Research Centre from computer science and trying to understand how these technologies of datafication and AI work in the background, what they do, what they can do, and maybe what we can do to make it all more transparent from a policy perspective. So just starting then to look at the kind of gambling and gamification. I have been teaching media courses for a number of years now, and we've been using books which had looked at the mediation and mediatization of society and the impact of the media on politics, on religion, and other spheres of life, building upon work of people like John B. Thompson from the UK and Andreas Hepp from Germany. But more recently, I see this work, and if you don't know it, I'll point you to it, because they've been starting to look at the impact of datafication, of kind of the embedment of this kind of what Shoshana Zuboff would call surveillance capitalism more generally within the media. And Andreas Hepp in this book and in the previous book with Nick Coldry from the LSE has started to talk about deep mediatization across society. And I really do think that we can start to look at how gambling is being mediatized and gambling is being normalized across lots of different areas in society, how gambling is becoming more and more prevalent across areas of terrestrial television, cinema, social media, digital media, and the ways in which this is deepening, in the language of Andreas Hepp, through datafication. And so here I want to bring together the mediatization literature, deep mediatization, with the kind of work on gamblification. And I think these are really give us some important insights to the blurring of boundaries we're talking about in this symposium. This is an overview of the report. It's about 100 pages. We can't go through it here today. Some of it, you know, the first section on international trends you may be very familiar with, but we wanted to then situate what we could see in Ireland. The report was very much caught up in some of the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, but we still managed to do some semi-structured interviews with across stakeholders in different sectors, from health to education, to sport in Ireland, and to the gambling industry themselves. And then start to look at the public policy sphere in Ireland. And this is where we really start to see, I suppose, the shadow of what's happening in the UK and the industry there, and its impact here in Ireland. We do adopt, and we're very aware of and have learned a lot from literature coming out of Canada around gambling, and I'm sure we have a lot more to learn. We were also aware that a lot of work on gambling had been informed by the kind of medicalization literature, the work on addiction, but we found more relevant to our background coming from sociology and politics and public policy. We found the literature on harms more useful for us. We were interested in the role of the design of gambling. We were interested in the exposure and increasing exposure that people have to gambling across different spheres in everyday life. And I'm very interested to hear from you of your work in kind of these broader areas. Why? Because when we start to look at the literature and the data on gambling, it is really clear that it is a huge industry now that we've started to pull together a little bit of the data that's provided. And it's incredibly difficult to get independent data where you're not relying on huge consultancy agencies with vested interests. And in many respects, that mirrors when I started to do my research on the games industry. They weren't clear categories in many of the kind of industrial surveys that we had. But we're seeing here, and this is data from the UK, the really significant growth and size of this industry in comparison even to sporting and other creative arts areas of society. And many of these data is available in the report, where we start to see the growth and scale of this industry. Ireland is such a small market. We're only a country of, you know, less than 5 million people. Many of these reports do not even include Ireland as a market or as an industry at all. But we will find data here on the UK, and we can track the growth of the UK. And many of the companies who are active in Ireland are also active in the UK. Here, though, what we do start to see in some of the data is that gambling in Ireland is growing, and that gambling losses are also highly significant in Ireland. So I suppose we have proxies for behavior and activities around gambling. And we can also see that the people who are involved in running the companies in gambling, here these are the Irish newspaper stories, and we start to see that Flutter Entertainment, who now owns Paddy Power and who has offices in Ireland but is quoted on the London Stock Exchange, you can see that despite the COVID lockdowns, despite a lot of sport being closed down, particularly horse racing, football, soccer, this industry is incredibly resilient. And why? Because of the online activities, because of the virtuality of many of these activities these days, and because of those mobile technologies that Gerda talked about. So we're talking about a highly significant industry, and at least in the Irish and the UK context, one that is making a lot of money and that is adapting to all of these different technologies to become really a normalized part of and very prevalent across many different media spheres. There's been very little work in the Irish context. We point here to two reports which had been done before, one by a clinical psychologist and one by somebody from an information and communications background. But really, most of this work is from 5-6 years ago, and really we believe probably isn't picking up a lot of the impact of the newer technologies as they're starting to play out in the current climate. And yet we know that gambling has a very long history in Ireland. We know that the state is also deeply embedded, and by the state I mean the government, in both promoting gambling, in taxing it, in running the national lotteries. We used to have something called the Irish sweepstakes, which was run across Ireland and internationally to fund social welfare, social hospitals in Ireland. So we have this really long tradition of it in Ireland, completely normalized, and certain things like the lottery is not even perceived as gambling in the Irish context. We also have a fairly lax regulatory regime. Casinos are illegal, but they have got a loophole where they're established as private members clubs. We have a lot of local lotteries, a lot of slot machines. They're not placed in pubs and public houses as they might be in other countries, but they are prevalent in many of our seaside towns. And we can see here from some of the media coverage the wild west of Ireland's rampant slot machine industry. We can see that we're starting to see media coverage that would suggest that this really is not a very well regulated area. Just before Christmas, one new piece of regulation came out to regulate slot machines and lotteries, but the larger area of online gambling is very unregulated in the Irish context. And this is really, I think, points to the fact that we really need to start doing a lot more research in this area. Gerda has already pointed to Paddy Power, who are a big company in the Irish context, are now part of Flutter Entertainment. We can see that they are mobilizing and working across many different areas and types of gambling. We can see that online gambling is the fastest growth area, and we can see that the UK is really significant in European terms in the online gambling space. But we can also see that gambling is increasingly being advertised across our media outlets. Here's a piece of work that just came out last year, which is looking at gambling advertising during live advertising of sport. And this really finds across sporting events on television, even before watersheds or any of this. We have really significant advertising on shirts and jerseys, on the billboards around the pitches, and that this is really normalizing, even for young people who are not meant to be gambling or not available to gamble and who are not meant to be targeted by these advertising or services. This is becoming very much part of the texture of how they experience different sports, particularly for young males. And so if you look at soccer, if you look at rugby, and if you look at the Gaelic games in Ireland, which are amateur, this is very much part of the live televised experience. If you look at the jerseys in many of the top UK teams, which a lot of Irish people follow, have promotion of advertising on their jerseys. In Ireland, we have a much smaller league, but some of the football clubs are now starting to take sponsorship on their jerseys from gambling companies. And so, you know, when we start to understand gambling and the gambling ecosystem in Ireland, what we have to realize, and this is based from a mapping that was done by Rebecca Cassidy in her book on the UK and what's happening in Gibraltar and Macau, we started to kind of map the key actors in Ireland. And while the industry and the state are really key actors, and the state has a national monopoly for the national lottery as a state monopoly, the industry is a huge player here in Ireland. There is really just a voluntary levy on them. They pay some tax. Well, we know that tax is a kind of a difficult issue in the Irish context for multinational, transnational companies. But the media is also a really significant player. And when I say the media, I mean it broadly in terms of television stations, stations increasingly relying on advertising from gambling companies. I'm talking about sporting bodies increasingly relying on advertising from gambling companies, and games services and apps increasingly also taking advertising, as well as building in game-like mechanics. So this really is about the deep mediatization of gambling, as well as the gamblification, at least for me, of media, sport, and digital games. And at least in the Irish context, we have very little knowledge and deep knowledge about what's going on. And we also do not have public health supports specifically for gambling disorders or addiction or difficulties or harms. We still very much rely on charity service providers and private service providers to support those who present with difficulties around gambling. And so even these types of prevalence studies are hugely out of date in the Irish context, but the most popular forms of gambling are lottery tickets, scratch cards, and sports betting. What we do know is that gambling is frequent, it's normalized, it's prevalent across Irish society. And in line with other countries, if I just draw your attention here, you can see that young males are very much the most prevalent, but these surveys are for 15 years and above. And we do know that through some of the apps and other areas, we believe that people much younger than this are both gaming and gambling and using games that are really blurring the boundaries with gambling. How do we know this? We know this from people who have come out and have spoken about their experiences, like this man, a postman who gambled almost 10 million. And stole a lot of money from the post office where he worked to feed his gambling habits. We know, sorry, I didn't mean to play that. We know from sports stars who have come out and who've talked about their stories. We know from media stories here people who have lost their houses and who've gambled to their last cent. And so the prevalence studies give us one insight. The media stories from people who are gambling addicts who are trying to address gambling provide us with another insight. And we also can see from these types of breaking stories where in horse racing in Ireland and in online gambling around other forms of sport, we're seeing some, pernicious forms of influence in different sports, where games, are coming out with very strange results, and then there's very strange gambling activity around the sporting events. This was a trainer of horses in Ireland who was banned, and they really can't tell what was going on around these. So in lots of these different areas, we're seeing gambling having an influence. Sorry, I had that already. And even in this, and this is the only area really in Ireland, the Gaelic Athletics Association, which is an amateur, Gaelic games are amateur games and sports in Ireland. They have come out quite strongly saying they won't take gambling sponsorship. They're now running support for their players who are amateurs, awareness campaigns around gambling. But, even when they're games are presented on live television, you still have the gambling advertising on other elements on the stations. So even if a body tries to take a stance around gambling, we're seeing the wider mediatization of gambling is kind of presenting problems for people in terms of exposure to gambling. So there's rising pressure in Ireland to do something in the regulatory space, but there really has been very little activity. Most of our gambling regulation dates back to the 1950s, unbelievably. And the only thing really that has been updated has been around the national lotteries. And so even actually the gambling companies are now looking for regulation in the Irish context. And just this morning when I double checked, and sorry that this is an addition to the slides that were sent for translation, we're seeing that what they're talking about and had been talking about responsibility and risks, the language is shifting a little bit to now talk about safety and well-being. I'm not sure this is actually going to provide us with, a better approach to public policy, but we're seeing a shift in how our policymakers are talking about how they might respond. But this is only in our Ministry for Justice. We do not see health, education, media starting to really engage around gambling. And so actually what we see in other countries is that gambling regulation in and of itself does not necessarily place limits on the spread of gambling or the ways in which mediatization and deep mediatization and gamblification is happening. In fact, gambling companies, the bigger ones, are looking for regulation because then they can actually, there's a certainty as to how they can operate. And Rebecca Cassidy talks about this, if you don't know her book, in kind of broader terms in other countries. So we're seeing a shift, in fact, even from the companies themselves, talking about corporate social responsibility to talking about safety. And this is just at the time where they're starting to use artificial intelligence technologies and new deep data technologies to track players, to monetize players, to really look at who are their top paying players, when do they check out around their losses, what kinds of incentives can they give the players to keep them playing. And here I see a lot of similarities with what were happening in free-to-play games over the last 5 years as well. This kind of risk modeling, getting to understand player engagement, then giving incentives to keep playing, and using the ad tech, advertising technology, to personalize the advertising and to nudge players, particularly those who pay, and who pay a lot. In games, they used to call them the whales. In gambling, maybe they're the VIPs, but these are the high spending players in both of these sectors. And this, to me, has to be looked at in the broader context of data-driven innovation or surveillance capitalism. This is all about knowing your customers and your clients and driving innovation and revenues. It is exactly the same language that we see in these Broadway types of policy documents. We see it in this literature on big data, for example, and we see it in this kind of hype around, and if you just look here, these are the Gartner hype cycles around analytics, machine learning, cryptocurrencies. These all kind of come together. And what we're seeing in games and gambling are part of the deployment of these new technologies as they have been developing in computer science. So when we start to think about datafication as critical social scientists, we come at it with perhaps different questions. We know that it's not just a technical development. It is, of course, a technical development from one perspective, but it is also about shifting cultural, political, and economic forms of power. And these are the sorts of things we need to be asking questions about, I think, as social scientists. And critical data studies, of which some of my colleagues in Maynooth, Rob Kitchen and Tracy Lariat, who was in Maynooth, was back now in Canada, really is saying that to research these areas, we have to realize these technologies and what they're doing. And the gathering of this data is not neutral and objective and independent. They're not raw representations of the world. They're asking particular questions. They're looking for particular types of information. And we explored this in a previous paper I was doing, where we're starting to look at how these technologies were deployed in smart cities and also in social media technologies. We have in many cases no choice, but we are included in these sorts of ecologies of datafication. When I walk down the central city of Dublin through the video feeds of the city, I am being surveyed for particular purposes. who and where is that information being shared with, who are the third parties. We have to think about these things as, on the one hand, yes, serving a function for maybe the people who are running the city, but also serving other functions which may also disempower citizens. So when, as Alison Powell in her recent book on optimization has talked about this, optimization from technology terms can also mean disempowerment for citizens and consumers. It may marginalize as well as optimize. And in this paper, we talk about the fact that, of course, we know about the data that we voluntarily give when we sign up, perhaps on the terms and conditions. What's perhaps more pernicious is our data shadow, the information that we don't know that is being connected, and what then that is being used for. And that is where I think, as critical social scientists, when we're studying the design and the production and the companies, we need to be focusing and asking our questions. And this is part of this kind of broader set of literature that I think game studies and gambling studies need to be kind of situating themselves within and asking these questions. And so thinking about it from the games perspective, of course, games of chance have a very long history. And when I started studying games and competitive games and sport almost 20 years ago, it was clear that we could make a boundary between games of chance, particularly gambling, and digital games. Now, when I go back to read the work of Roger Calois or other people, it's really interesting to look at the terminology in different languages around games of hazard, games of chance, dice, and the kind of this literature of player being passive, surrendering to fate, which is so different from the ways in which competitive gambling is actually sold to us. In my book, Global Games, I point to the fact that with social media apps and with the development of mobile games, we were starting to see what I call in the book new production logics. And I take the production logic approach from the French scholar Bernard Miege, who looked at the production logics in film and book publishing and television and other creative cultural industries. And I started to argue that perhaps there were new production logics emerging, one around esports, performance and competition, and the ways in which esports are kind of borrowing from competitive sports, particularly in North America, but also the broadcast television aspects of sports and bringing them together. And then when I looked at social media apps, mobile apps, and particularly freemium, giving away games for free kind of made no sense until you started to look at the microtransactions and the datafication and the ways in which they could track the play of the players. And of course, this brings game players into the peruse and the area of, at least in Europe, data protection. And this is one of the areas where we can see some responses emerging around games and gamblification in Europe is around data privacy legislation and around data protection for game players and consumers. Now, Gerda has already given us some examples, and I'm just keeping an eye on time here. Martin, do wave a hand at me as I'm looking at my full screen here. But when we start to look at these games like Clash of Clans, when we look at Crushing Candy, when we look at Farmville, when we look at Pokemon Go and the later games around geolocation, all of these have new intermediaries who are gathering the data. They're bringing in and hiring data scientists into the game design companies, right? They're actually also really looking at virtual items. And this was very different from games of the previous decade, right? And they were doing very much data-driven, content-targeted selling of the games, marketing of the games, which really has been going on for about 10 years or more now in this space. When I started to look at mobile games, they were given away for free, but they did not have this app ecosystem behind them. With the launch of the Android App Store, the Apple App Store, now game developers were able to tap into the affordances of those app stores and things like the Facebook ecosystem, really to be able to build new circulatory, well, probably better to say circuits of data gathering and monetization. This is a job ad for somebody to work in a games company. What you're looking for, an understanding of somebody who could do deep data analysis and A/B testing, and then work with the designers of the games, dig into the data and adjust the game design depending on how the data is coming back to the game companies. These data scientists are embedded in the data in some companies in the game design teams, in other companies in the marketing teams. And we're just starting to see some great literature being published now by many scholars in Canada, other scholars in Tampere, looking at the ways in which data governance and data surveillance, we're seeing these kind of blurred boundaries between games, datafication, and gambling. In my book, Global Games, I talk about not just design and production as being key, but also circulation. And this is where I now put the player-generated content, design, marketing, and metrics, or the datafication, and also these community managers who help to drive community engagement as well. And these work together as an interface, if you like, between the game design companies and the consumers. And technology is very much part of this. These are the types of games we're talking about. One of the biggest ones, I suppose, in the last few years, probably also in Canada, would be something like Fortnite. If you look at Pokemon Go, this is the main street in Dublin. Again, geolocation here. I mean, it's fun, it's play, it's given away for free. But increasingly, advertising, marketing, gamblification, and gaming mechanics are coming into these free-to-play games. And people are making a lot of money. You know, it is very much a battle royale game, but it is also a battle royale for consumers, for our time, our attention, and our data. Over 1 billion. Really quite significant. So as we go through this, I think you start to see, even in a free-to-play game, you can start to see the sales of virtual items and, you know, how this can play into other aspects of gender and class. This is a really, you know, interesting quotation from a child who's a player of Fortnite. If you're using a default skin, people will think you're trash or you're poor. You need to buy the skins to demonstrate, you know, your status or to show yourself off in different ways within the game. And of course, Gerda, I'm sure in terms of consumption, can tell us more about this. Some of the games that we're seeing from the game revenues, really, really huge revenues. And this is already just, you know, over a year ago in terms of the types of revenues in free-to-play games. A recent issue journal article that just came out from Journal of Consumer Culture really points to this, right? Talking about the gamblification of digital games and how we really need to start thinking about risk and responsibility in terms of what companies are doing and in terms of thinking about who's responsible for managing risk and responsibility in this area of gambling and games. And I think, and I probably should just finish here, that, you know, the loot boxes is just really one important area where we're seeing game companies being pushed to say, is this a game mechanic or a gambling mechanic? And they're not, at least in Europe, going to be allowed to make that decision themselves. It has already been declared as gambling. And we have already had the games organizations like PEGI coming out and saying, we need more notices for in-game purchases, and we need to respond to gambling mechanics. So I think perhaps I should leave time here now for a broader discussion on this. I had a few more things to say, but I would like to point out that how we're understanding and thinking about risk and responsibility in this area, I think, is changing and is having to change. The companies are pushing with more media literacy, information to consumers. But I think with AI and AI regulation coming in Europe as well, we're going to see pressure for other approaches to thinking about the blurring boundaries between games and gambling. And Ireland is at the forefront of this because many of the multinationals have their headquarters in Ireland, their European headquarters. So Ireland's task is actually also to regulate data protection and to pursue some of the ways in which these companies are perhaps breaking current legislation. Thank you very much.